I said how nice of her to look after her brother or sister, and looked at the baby. I was horrified. It was so deformed, and its skin so white. The nurse explained to me that it wasn't her brother, it was her own, and her father was its father. Incest was practiced as part of their religion. We went over to her father to pay for the potatoes, to buy potatoes. There was a dirty, ugly, he was a dirty, ugly, bearded monster. His wife cowered closely by, as did many children of all ages. When I paid for the potatoes, I deliberately gave the money to his wife, who immediately gave it to the husband. I told him I gave that money to pay. I gave them money to pay for the potatoes to make sure he used some of it for his family. Children hovering around like dogs with their tails between their legs. He acquiesced by cutting up raw potatoes and throwing them on the ground, and the children scrambled to get them and ate them raw. Can't very well say they were in chicken dirt. I wrote to the papers and welfare about conditions. There were some improvements, but very little they could do to help the religious cult. I despaired when the newspapers and TV told of communities where polygamy and incest are still practiced here in BC recently. To put it very rudely and strongly, women are treated merely as receptacles to relieve their husbands' sexual urges. I spoke openly of the conditions that existed, that despaired at the response, and became quite unpopular in the area. I volunteered to be sent to the moon, if necessary, to get out of Vanderhoof. There were whispers and speculation it might be possible to send rockets to the moon at some time. We were soon transferred back to Vancouver Island again, and my husband resigned from his position and worked for BC Hydro, which had just been established in order for us to stay in Victoria, where our children could get a better education. If at some time you happen to be in a gathering single cad, where if at some time you happen to be in a gathering and "O Canada" is sung, the funny old lady that's singing so loud and proudly will be me. Thank God my parents had the foresight to bring us to Canada. I shall fight till the last maple leaf to preserve our country as one strong and free Canada. Okay? Mm-hmm. In 1936, going back again, we moved to West Vancouver permanently. There were quite a few people had settled there, but the real boom didn't start until after the bridge was opened in 1939. Queen Elizabeth and King George VI came over to open it. We depended on the ferries. You could drive to North Van if it was a car ferry, or go across the second Narrows Bridge. There was a small shopping centre, but most people went to Vancouver to shop. Once the bridge was built, development soon followed. However, owing to rationing during the war, we had to restrict driving. The CPR ran a 2-day sailing to Victoria, one at 10 a.m., the other at midnight, which was known as the honeymoon special. It left from Fort and Granville, and it took all night long route round Savory Island, and arrived in Victoria at 7 a.m. You could get staterooms from $2.50 up. Young men could get a berth or dormitory type room for 50 cents. When you arrived at the ship, your bags were checked through to Victoria. If you needed bags on board, they were taken to your stateroom and then picked up before you left, and you got them when you went ashore. The steward would also collect your shoes and deliver them polished in the morning. Breakfast would be brought to your stateroom, or you could go to the dining room or coffee shop. Coffee was 5 cents a cup. Toast was also 5 cents. They served all the meals on board and with grandeur. Your waiter stood at your table, clean towel over his arm, and served you with perfect protocol and aplomb. The stores were most obliging. If you were purchasing articles, clothing, etc., you would phone the store. It would be delivered to your home on approval. If you didn't want it, it would be picked up and returned to the store. All free, of course. The Bay Spencers now Eaton's, and Woodward's all had free delivery every day. When Woodward's first opened in Victoria, and also the Bay and Spencer's, now Eaton's provided a phone-in service for your groceries. You could go in and select them yourself and have them delivered, or if you preferred, you could phone before noon and they would be delivered that day. When you shop, no matter how small the article, the clerk would ask delivery or carry. There was no charge for the service. During the war, in order to save gas, which was strictly rationed, signs were pasted on billboards in shops saying, "Can you carry your parcel and save gas for the war effort?" Gradually, after the war, all these extras diminished and vanished away to inflation. Safeway was the only store up to then that was completely self-serve. The bigger department stores had a phone-in service and small shopping baskets, which you helped yourself and went through a cashier. Larger orders were also delivered free of charge and right to your kitchen. Here we go back again, 1927. We got our first radio in 1927. It was a long walnut box which sat on top of a bookcase. It was about 12 inches deep and 24 inches long, the round speaker in the middle. It was an RCA super heterodyne, and we sat around it every night and listened to Amos and Andy, Jack Benny and Mary Livingstone, The Shadow, and local programs, The Happy Gang. Most boys in those days made crystal sets, small radios that fit into a matchbox and had earphones, and it could pick up local programs. Matches were very much a part of every kitchen. Most houses had a metal box that the matches fitted into and had a dispenser for the matches. Those were usually painted cream or red or green. Matches were necessary because you depended on them to light the fire in your stove. We also had a 3-ring gas grill on the end of the stove, which was great for quick cooking or boiling a kettle in the morning, but you depended on wood and coal for heat for your kitchen. Victoria didn't have gas, and many of the houses had sawdust burners. They had a hopper attached to the end of the stove, which one had to keep filled. This meant a large bin of loose sawdust in the basement, which had to be carried upstairs to fill the hopper. They were very messy, and you had to be careful not to spill any sawdust when filling the hopper. If you were delivered a load that wasn't fur or was damp, you had to struggle because it just would not burn and get hot enough to heat the oven or make baking possible, and cooking really frustrating. We couldn't buy fridges or electric stoves during the war, and if you didn't have one, you had to get the saw and cut wood. At one time during the war, when most husbands were overseas or in the service away from home, a fuel project was set up where a truck was supplied and several men would get together and saw down trees in a designated spot. They were delivered in lengths of about 4 feet, but had to be sawed and chopped, stacked and dried before you could use them. Many of us used an old pram and went down to the beach and gathered bark, which we dried. It made good fuel, but you had to have dry wood to get it started. We had a stove in the kitchen and a wood heater in the living room to heat the house. My husband and I were fortunate, and I finally managed to get a wartime house. It had 2 bedrooms, bathroom, front room, and kitchen and shed. Most people who moved to Victoria in the early years of the war lived in rooming houses. There was a great influx of servicemen and no housing, so people put up with what they could get. Clothes were not rationed, but we sometimes wished they were because they were so hard to find. Before my first child was born, I searched in vain for vests and clothes for him. As soon as stores got them in, they were snatched up. There was a real baby boom at the time in Victoria. Some people would hoard whatever was scarce. My doctor finally gave me a prescription for baby vests, which I took to the Bay and got supplied just before my baby was due to come home from the hospital. We were kept in hospital for 14 days after our babies were born, and in bed for 10 days. We were in a weakened condition by the time they let us come home because of our inactivity. Most of us sneaked out of bed at night and moved around a bit. I actually managed at one time to sneak down the hall and take a shower. We used to wash our hair in the basin stand in the bathroom, and we had to get it towel dry before we could sneak back to our ward. The hospital was short of linens and everything. The nurses made the beds in those days, and when the clean laundry came down, they would rush to get their share for their patients. And quite often it was still damp, and so it would be dried in your room. It was not possible to get a private room unless you were very ill, and all rooms were overcrowded. There were beds in the hallways, and anywhere you could get them in. The hospital had girls in training attached to them. These girls lived in dorms in a separate building and had to work very hard in the wards, besides study and get their training times. They were often poorly fed. Institutional meals. Patients, if they were fortunate enough to have relatives in Victoria, would have food brought into them. Most of the women were wartime wives, and their relatives were still across Canada. And often the father would have been shipped out somewhere else prior to being sent overseas. I was fortunate because my husband's family lived in Victoria. There was a store in towns where you could rent strollers for 25 cents a day. Few people had cars, so if you brought your child to town, it was great having a place where you could get a carriage for the day. We brought them into elevators. You could leave them at the front of the stores like the Bay or Spencer's, and they never got stolen. We left the carriages, not the babies. People were more tolerant of each other and seldom complained when a stroller, we call them buggies, would go into the elevator and they would have to wait for the next one. We walked miles with our babies. It was easier than carrying them on the streetcar. Babies wore flannelette nighties and cloth diapers and wore knitted soakers. Waterproof were unattainable during the war. Plaster or latex was unheard of, and all rubber went for the war effort. The child was usually wrapped in a baby blanket topped with a lacy shawl, and very awkward to carry. They used to slip out the bottom when you couldn't hold them with both hands. Now I don't know why. This goes back to when we first came to Canada, the early 20s. My father's cousin was the head cook of B.T. Rogers of sugar fame family. They had a beautiful mansion in Shaughnessy. It's still there on 59th and Granville. It was surrounded by bush when we went there, 28, 29, 30s. They had many servants, much like upstairs, downstairs. We used to visit our relative there. She worked there for years until she retired, and much respected by the Rogers. They had a farm and, of course, a gardener, more than one, a butler, many maids, a housekeeper, a chauffeur, cook. The chauffeur's house is still at the entrance to the estate. The main house still is there, too. The buildings are all... I don't know what it is. The buildings are all... I don't know what. There are buildings all built around, I guess. The property has been turned into condominiums and is called Shannon Mews, actually, which is the name of the main house. It was a magnificent home, very grand. We were taken to view it when the Rogers were away. One of the bathrooms on the main floor had a child-sized toilet and basin stand. There used to be a page in the newspaper called the Society page. The comings and goings of the elite were duly recorded, and these pages were quite often read about one of the Rogers going abroad. I remember during one visit the cook brought us in some raspberries. We visited in the servants' sitting room. My sister said, "Be careful, there might be worms in them." So we managed somehow to bury the raspberries in a plant when no one was noticing. We used to go there by streetcar. It was a one-way track, and I think it must have gone out either Oak Street or Cambie Street. The streetcar would have to wait until the other streetcar came up from Marine Drive, and they exchanged a paddle so they knew they wouldn't meet another streetcar. The car going to town would then switch on the double track and proceed to town. I'm not sure where they did this, but we had a long way to walk through paths and bushes and along unpaved sidewalks until we reached Granville Street. There were few houses. It was really rural. When Rogers were away, there was a surplus of milk. Mary Ann, the cook, couldn't stand waste. It was the worst of the Depression, and many families were needy, but too proud to admit it. Anyway, we would be phoned and told to come and get some milk. My mother used to send my sister and I, and we would be given a large pail of milk, luckily with a lid, which we had to carry all the way to the streetcar. It would bump against your legs, and the handle would cut into your fingers. It was miserable, and we hated doing it. When we got home, my mother would strain it and boil it in case it had germs. There were many families who benefited from this, but we never did because my mother started to give it to neighbors who were grateful for it. I soon learned to put something on the lid in the pail, and in no time I would have to carry on. Oh, I soon learned to loosen the lid on the pail, and in no time I would have to carry only half a pail. The smaller corner grocery stores proudly had a delivery service. The smaller corner grocery stores provided delivery service. They would hire a boy or young man to deliver with his bike. They had to travel quite long distances at times with heavy, unsteady loads. They were paid about $2.50 a week. Old age pensions. My father was 21 years older than my mother, and he became eligible for the old age pension. And when he became eligible, you had to have a means test. In those days, very embarrassing for a proud man like my father. He passed the test and was paid $2.50 a month. He came to Victoria to visit us and stayed a few days. Someone reported him to the pension board, and he lost his pension. However, when the war broke out, he was still very active for his age, and he kept active and recovered his financial state. He built a new house and furnished it with furniture and lived to be 90 years old, prosperous and very happy. In the 20s, here's Frank, now what do you do? Get supper when he comes home? In the 1920s, 1929 specifically, our parents and friends discussed the stock market a great deal with anxiety. They talked a lot about wells. Of course, I thought there was some sort of water supply. I shall never forget the day of the crash when my father came home and told my mother what had happened. She became hysterical and almost screaming. She took it so badly. Many people we knew committed suicide. The lady that owned the bakery down the street cast herself in her oven. Our neighbor went for a walk to Little Mountain with his two little girls. He sent them home and he threw himself off the cliff. My uncle was a streetcar conductor, and 3 people at different times threw themselves in front of a streetcar. Devastating experience for him, so he decided to stop working. I guess we'll quit there.
Okay.
Sure. We leave for a walk at Little Mountain. Girls, he sent them home and he threw himself off the cliff. Just a minute, I can't read this. My uncle, oh yeah.
You're talking about Uncle driving the
Streetcars, that where we left
when you
off?
left, and then we started
Okay.
talking about him.
Is it turned on?
Mm-hmm. My uncle was a streetcar conductor, and 3 people at different times threw themselves in front of a streetcar. It was a devastating experience for him.
So he decided to stop working. He went back to work during the war, and when he wanted to retire, he couldn't because his job was compulsory service. Women soon became streetcar conductors and drove the milk trucks and the bread trucks. It seemed strange at the time, but it was the beginning of liberation for women. They worked in all services. What the heck is this doing here? They worked in all the services. Oh, and proved themselves. What a pity that all those years women were just houseworkers and thought of as intellectually inferior. If women had had more control of their lives, I don't think there would have been so many wars, and I'm sure a cure would have been found for cancer and other diseases. We probably wouldn't have trips to the moon or space, but I don't think we would have food banks either. This I wrote last night. Either now. During the war, when our first child was born, we were fortunate enough to get a wartime house in Victoria. There was a large block of them built on an area on Dallas Road, which was bush. This property is close to Beacon Hill Park and is now very prime property, but the wartime houses still occupy the area. We paid $25 per month rent. Our house was a 2-bedroom, bathroom, living room with a miscellaneous addition added to the rear. This area had an earth floor and was a woodshed. The rest was hardwood fir. They also had one wood heater during the war in the living room. At first we had a wooden coal stove in the kitchen, but we found a second-hand electric stove later on. There was no insulation in the houses, and you depended on the wood stove in the kitchen and the oil stove for heat. Although our stove I put oil, it was wood. After a while, it was almost impossible to get wood because most of the men were in military service or compulsory service, and so we used to scrounge our wood from the beach. Our husbands would find large logs and saw them up, saw it into smaller pieces and bring it home. These were prime fir logs, and I remember one which was nearly 4 feet through. Finally, an arrangement was made where a flat deck truck was available, and an area for us somewhere in the Malahat was made available, and trees were cut into 4-foot lengths and could be purchased by shipyard workers. You had to saw them into stove-length pieces. There were still many families who couldn't afford this, so they relied on beech wood. There was always lots of bark, and it was good for burning in fireplaces. During the Depression, my husband's family and all the families on the waterfront area got all their firewood off the beach. It was a big job and hard labor, and this task fell onto my husband as he was the elder brother, and his father was away at sea on the tugboats and got very little time at home, seldom more than 1 day a month, if that. Now tugboat men get 1 hour off for every hour worked, plus holidays and many other benefits. But there is no longer much work for them, as towing log booms was their main source of revenue. It is now done by freight equipped for the job. When the war ended, we had the option of buying our houses. Ours, which is still there, was on Oswego and Montreal Street. We bought it for $2,450. Payments $25 a month. It quickly went up in value, and we sold it to move to a better environment for our children who were due to start school. We had visited a farm in Deep Cove where my husband's family rented a summer cottage. It had developed a little, and there was a school, and seemed to us the best place for our children, so we sold our house and bought a piece of property in Deep Cove. We had 10 acres and built a house, payday by payday and board by board. At first it was just covered in building paper. Many young families were in the same circumstances. Same circumstances, really. A number of them, ex-Air Force men who had been stationed at Pat Bay, who wanted to stay in BC. We knew very little about gardening or anything else related to country living, but we had such a wonderful time then. The children loved it. We bought 2 goats from a neighbor. We knew nothing about goats, but were advised they were good milkers, and you couldn't tell the difference between it and cow's milk. We couldn't afford to build a barn at the time for a cow. We got books from the library about goats. My husband built a lovely little log house for them, and we waited anxiously for the kids to be born. My husband and I stayed out in the barn the whole time the labor was going on. We were also told in the book to make small coat-type covers for the young kids to protect them from the cold. Also, this is the absolute truth, to provide bottles to feed them with so their mother's teats would not be stretched. I sterilized bottles and bought special nipples for the goats, and my husband milked the one goat we named Murgatroyd. After about 2 weeks of chasing her all over 10 acres to catch her in order to milk her, we didn't call her Murgatroyd for long. We called her Blankety Blank. He would tie a leash around her horns and pull her up the hill. She would dig in with her hooves and plow her way up. One time, her tether caught on a branch, branch of an alder tree, and as my husband moved up the hill, Murgatroyd became airborne. He soon noticed the extra weight, but also decided to sell the goats. No one would drink the milk. It was terrible stuff. We used to pour it down at the bottom of the property where no one could smell it. Finally, our neighbors came to our rescue, and they doubled over laughing at us. In fact, the whole community came to have a laugh. They couldn't believe what we were doing. We set the kid goats free and made a milking stand, and the kids fed themselves. Unfortunately, they had been imprinted on me as their mother and followed me everywhere and called me Ma, Ma, just like my own children did. If the door to our house was closed, they stood outside and every chance they got and learned to hide. Wait a minute, I can't even read this. If the door to our house was closed, they stood outside and got in every chance they got and learned to hide so they wouldn't be thrown out. I guess one of the most embarrassing moments was an occasion when 2 of the community's respected wealthier dowagers came for tea. I had to unpack all my good china, take out my good linen, serviettes for the occasion. We were all on our best social behavior, embarrassed about our nearly completed but not finished house, when a loud bleat blurted out from the Chesterfield on which they were sitting, and out came 2 kid goats. I prayed our not very good temporary floorboards would give way under my feet, but we just laughed. The ladies did not laugh. They were horrified and soon departed. However, most of our neighbors had a wonderful time, had a much-needed laugh about it. Occasionally, we still meet them, and sometimes under sad circumstances. They were mostly older than us, and I should start that again. Read it first. Occasionally we still meet them, our old neighbors, sometimes under sad circumstances, as they were mostly older than us. And one friend who had recently lost his very beloved wife, when recounting our goat story, laughed and started us all up. He said he thought he would never laugh again, but if his wife was present, she would be laughing the loudest. I believe it helped him through a grievous experience. We lived on a side road, unpaved, and I was expecting another baby. My husband had got his apprenticeship as a power lineman and was transferred up to Gabriola to install power lines. The baby was due in late March. I had planned on going into Victoria to have the baby and would leave about a week before the impending birth. However, on March the 10th, we awoke to an unheard of amount of snow. We had an A40 Austin, a small car. It was parked at the bottom of the road, I use the word loosely, on our property. I awakened the children, our oldest two, 12. I awakened the children, our oldest two, 12 and 10, and we put the chains on the car. The power was off and no telephone. We couldn't get the car up the hill. On our property were old steel china crate covers used for shipping goods from China, usually porcelain, dishware, etc. They were mesh and very strong. I put them under the front wheels, and the car got traction and moved over them. I pulled them out from the behind, and when we had passed over them, put them in the front again, and we got to the top of the hill. However, during the night, the grader had gone by and had plowed the snow up and left it beside our car. We managed somehow to dig it out. We got on the road, and away we went. The chains broke. We skidded and slid and cajoled the car into moving. Please don't stop. There was something went wrong somewhere, and we could only go in low gear. So I threw out the clutch, and we coasted down hills. It was very difficult getting the car into gear again, but luckily it was mostly downhill to my mother-in-law's, and we made it, and I went off in a taxi and had my lovely little girl. My husband came home, and he got a mechanic to look at the car. He told us it was impossible the car had been driven. The universal and a lot of the other running gear was blue from the heat caused by the friction. It never went again and was towed away for junk. It was our first car, and we overloaded it and took it on long trips full of children and dogs, roof stacked as high as we could reach with camping gear and fishing tackle. Thanks for the memories, you dear little A49 Austin, which had seating for 4, but which were squeezed many more. And we went and saw so many places. This is all jerky.
No.
My husband was injured. A lightning arrestor fell off a pole on top of him. He was working below it and ended up in hospital in Kamloops, and the children and I were alone, of course. It was winter, and of course it came early and unexpected. We ran out of fuel. We had an electric stove but needed wooden coal for our heater. The house was still uninsulated. We phoned the fuel dealer, but he couldn't get his truck up the hill, so we were stuck, almost. I decided to saw some of our trees. We had a large wooded area. Some of the trees down, we had a large wooded area, and get our own fuel. I didn't know anything about trees, which were best for fuel, so I just sawed down the ones with the smallest trunks, which turned out to be laurel. I didn't know that wood had to be dried before it was burned, and we had a terrible time. I found a limb of a fir tree which had pitch on it, and I realized this was good for burning, so I searched for small branches with pitch on them. Soon ran out, so by the time I had been told wood had to be dried in order to burn, so I would get up. By that time I had been told wood had to be dried in order to be burned. So I get up early in the morning and saw wood, put it in the oven to dry, and then I could light the heater. I built a supply of dry wood this way. The snow continued and the roads were muddy, impossible for a truck to deliver coal. So I continued with my sawing and drying when possible. But I decided to take a chance on the roads and take the Austin into Sydney and buy sacks of coal. We lunged over humps and skidded through ditches and made it to the fuel supply. We opened the A40's trunk and loaded 2 sacks of coal on it, 200 pounds, and tied it on with ropes, and we managed to get back to the house. We dared not park on top of the hill, so we got the children's sleigh and faced it down our road, which was under snow. Then we stood on the back of the car and pushed the coal sacks down one at a time. It hit the sleigh and it took off straight for the house, right to the back door. The second one followed and got close enough so we had no trouble getting it in onto the porch and in smaller sacks, and our fuel supply was assured. My husband was released from hospital and came home in a cast, which is not used now. His arm was bent at the elbow. A piece of steel that had held the bone protruding, sticking out the back, his hand above his head. He was amazed when he got home and saw how we had managed. We didn't ask anyone for help, although many had relied on my husband to help them. My husband asked me how I had managed to saw the trees and the wood. The saw was so blunt it wouldn't cut very well. He sent it out to be sharpened, told me to try it out. It slipped through the wood as though it was butter. All my frustrations came to the fore, and for the first time I sat and cried. We still have that saw. I will never part with it. It was a 6-foot cross-cut, 2-man saw. We have always worried about impending depressions and how our children would manage. After their childhood experiences and independence and making do and finding a way to do it themselves, I think they were better equipped than most. My husband recovered and went back to work. He was transferred to Sea Shelter, and we rented a house on the beach. The children went to school and had a wonderful seaside summer. Our house was always full of welcome guests. We moved back to Victoria soon as our children went to high school. Arthur worked as a lineman for BC Hydro and was permanently settled in Victoria. We bought a lovely old house, and Arthur and the children completely renovated it. Insulated, replumbed, rewired, completely renovated the kitchen, put a rumpus room and bathroom down the basement, all by themselves. The experience did them good stead for their own homes. They were self-sustained, all of them. All of them finished They were self-sustained, is that right? They were self-sustained, all of them finished university. There were jobs available, and they did it themselves. We paid $6,500 for the house, $60 a month, including taxes, payment, and interest, or PIT as it was then known. We sold when the children were on their own for $30,000. It was almost immediately sold for $44,000. We're told the government paid the last owner $254,000 when it was torn down in order to make a bypass for the highway. We had wonderful, happy times in it. All our children's friends were welcome anytime. Sunday dinner was usually close to 20 people. My husband and sons used to hunt, and we usually had a haunch of venison in the freezer. We had a large kitchen with a very large round table. We ate in the dining room on Sundays, and we usually had so many people. I used to put the food on the round table. They would help themselves and take it to the dining room. We had an extra table we put on if it reached into the living room. I remember Sunday when I cooked a whole haunch of venison, and I cooked in foil with bacon strips and a package of onion soup, delicious. I also had a 29-pound turkey and a leg of pork and 4 large chiffon cakes. Not a crumb of anything was left when the crowd got through. One of our sons had 4 boys and 1 girl for dinner that day. what? Our children, of course, have grown and moved away and don't have much contact with their school friends anymore. But there are many of them that we still see, and some of them have brought their children around to meet us. We always accepted billets when visiting bands came to our children's schools. Our children would say, "I can take 6." The teachers would phone to confirm, and of course we took 6. We had bedrooms next to the rumpus room and a kitchen where they could get more to eat or stay up practicing their instruments. One year we had Eskimos from Churchill. They went to school in Churchill, Manitoba, but from farthest points north. They were very shy, and other parents asked us how we coped with them. They usually had only one billet. We explained we had a complete suite. They had a complete suite to themselves. This isn't exact. Yeah. And they could play their drums, guitars, etc., and use it as they wanted. They had an older Eskimo gentleman with them who played the skin drum. He couldn't understand English and usually sat alone by himself. I sat with him one day when the children were playing a concert in the park. Before the concert was over, we were communicating and laughing at our mistakes, and he was so happy. He had 4 sons, and so did I. His wife and I were the same age. I learned a lot about Eskimo life. I couldn't talk Eskimo, and he couldn't talk English, but we communicated. This is apart from Deep Cove, that you'd have gone with Deep Cove. We bought a cow and built a barn. We bought it from our neighbor who told us it had its first calf, which came with the cow. It was a very poor milker and couldn't give enough milk to supply its own calf. We had the dairyman from the Department of Agriculture come and look at it. He couldn't believe the calf belonged to the cow because the cow was between 18 and 20 years old. We gave her to someone who wanted her, probably to make sausage out of. It was an expensive lesson for us, and we could not easily afford it. We had also paid $15 for a goose from another neighbor. We intended to get a gander and raise geese. However, we soon found this supposedly purebred Toulouse goose was past laying eggs, but we kept her as a pet. She was loving, and she was very loving, and at one time, our toddler of the day had got out the gate and was nearing the road when Lady, as we called her, flew out to him squawking and around us. Our son fell, and she stood on him until we rescued him. We gave her to a large, kindly family when we moved, and she lived to be 21 years old. I read all this? Or did I not?
No, I don't think so.
Well, the rest of this. Oh, no. This is about clothes. This is good. People wore more clothes and dressed up more when they went to picnics on the beach and outings. Of course, that'd be outings. Women might wear a print cotton dress, but also wore a hat and stockings. If the weather was colder, they would wear a coat and perhaps overshoes in the snow. They always wore a vest and pants with longer legs and elastic at the knees. Men always wore overcoats over their suits, except in summer. Men wore hats, suits with vests, pants held up with braces, and stiff collars fastened to the shirt with a stud. Women always wore corsets, and it would be frowned on if they didn't. They were made of heavy cotton, sometimes had whole long ribs, and sometimes had whalebone ribs, and could be full length or waist length. Later on, elastic girdles were worn, and a brassiere. I never wore corsets or a girdle. I was very thin, but even so, I don't think I would wear a corset or girdle. I never have. When I got married, my mother-in-law was horrified that I didn't wear corsets, so she made an appointment with the Spirella lady to come to our house to measure me. I acquiesced to the fitting